Welcome to Rogue Frequencies. I'm Olivia.
And I'm Matt.
We talk about punk music and culture, but not always in the way you would expect. We are using all things punk as a way to think and learn more about individual and collective human growth and development. As always, for the purposes of our conversation, we are creating our own distinctive groupings to reflect on human experiences and self-discovery. Our groupings are not meant to be definitive, all-inclusive categorizations, but to give us a shared frame of reference to articulate concepts. And today, we're excited because we're doing something a little bit different. Matt, you want to tee us up?
Yeah, we're not grouping anything. We're talking about a band, a single band, and what that band has meant to both of us and our punk rock journeys, and kind of the influence that this band has had, not just on us as individuals, but on this whole project. And just like this whole journey that you and I have been on for well over a year at this point in time. Right? And that band is NOFX. LA's own, recently retired, punk rock royalty in a lot of ways. Super excited to get into them and all the things that NOFX has meant to both of us. And I think when I think about this band, I get transported into my early punk rock journey. That the time I spent at shows at the end of my high school days and the beginning of college, and that period of time when you're finding yourself and you're coming of age and you're trying on hats, so to speak, and trying to figure out who you are. And NoFX just seemed to always be there in my youthful experiences. And I have these great memories of, being, in, 17, 18, 19 years old, seeing NoFX, meeting Fat Mike at a Warped Tour, and getting his autograph on this old Spitfire skateboards hat that I still have, with all its sweat stains and cigarette burns on the bill and all these sorts of things. And just like, punk rock to me in a lot of ways is NoFX. It's the grittiness, both in terms of character, but also fortitude to continue to strive and reach for your goals. It's the attitude of caring but not looking like you care. The rawness of this band that like can play their instruments and write really good songs, but it all doesn't always come across that way. Dysfunction, function, just creative energy, like so much of what punk rock is to me is encapsulated in NoFX overall. And I think that any exploration of how, we can see ourselves through punk has to incorporate NoFX. They're just such an integral part of the punk rock experience in my mind anyway.
Yeah, and here we are as of our recording. We're a year out from their final tour.
Which is
And
crazy.
I know, right? It's been a whole year. And it's still crazy to me that they're done.
I know.
So 40 years of music history, and they made the decision, which we'll talk about in a little bit, to intentionally I'd say decouple, but degroup. A very intentional, not breaking up the way we think about bands breaking up. They're infighting, they can no longer hold it together, but an active choice of family to not be in that iteration anymore and to move on to the next thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's, you just saying that right now and thinking, that this is kind of when I would start, you'd have the summer tours and, bands playing festivals and all that sort of stuff. And then you get the winter tours, when bands are hitting inside venues, so to speak, and all that sort of stuff. And thinking like, this is that time where you started, looking for like, when's NoFX coming to town? Cause they were always there, right? This was a band that was always around. And, I can think back to flipping through CDs and the first NoFX CD that I owned and the first one that really hit for me, So Long and Thanks for All the Shoes. And just that band and what they've meant to so many people, fans, musicians, the punk rock industry, that Mike creating the Punk Rock Museum in Las Vegas and a celebration of punk culture and history with a really strong emphasis on the 90s era. Which was so important for so many of us who have gotten into punk. Yeah, it's just it is wild to think that NoFX is gone, even though, I mean, if you're still following on your feeds and stuff, the A through Z series where they're dropping all those singles and stuff that they still have out there, it's always nice to open up and like, oh, something new from NoFX, and then the weird like, oh, it's it's old new. It's not new new, but it's still something there to help you out. But yeah, man, NoFX just so energetic and important for this project. Even this was your idea at a NoFX show to do this.
Yeah, something new out of something ending,
Yeah,
which is sort of a circle of life moment. So, yeah, I'll talk about that for a minute. We were at that show together with our respective significant others. And to give you all a little Matt and Liv lore, I met Matt's wife back in, I think, 2006. So a minute ago. And we played a sport together and stayed friends. And Matt and Meg got married. And eventually I partnered up with my partner, Aaron. And we've become band buddies. We check out many concerts together. We've been to many shows together. Matt, as we've alluded to, being essentially a lifelong punker, and me having flashes of punk in my high school days, but really coming back to it in full force over the last 12, 13 years. So, of course, when NoFX was coming through for the last time, we were all, hells yeah, let's go. And we saw them in Denver. Was it last August? I should know this. I have the
yeah,
concert poster.
yeah. 24.
Yeah. And while we were there, and actually, I'll make sure to throw a photo up in somewhere in our show notes or something, a link to the photo, because there's a photo of us together at that
Yeah,
show,
yeah.
actually. And as we were enjoying the music, I had one of these moments where I was in a real heady space around my coaching practice and what is my coaching identity that I could articulate my ethos. I had been coaching for a little bit, but I hadn't yet really gotten clear on what my unique point of view was. It was here, but I hadn't articulated it. And as I looked out among the bands and dancing with my friends and looking out, well, I was dancing, Matt stands, Aaron stands.
Too old for the pit these days.
No pogoing for you.
No, no. I mean, every now and then.
Every
Every
now
now
and
and then
then.
you can get me in the pit, but
I've seen it.
definitely not.
But standing there and looking out and having one of those divine downloads, it's like, oh, punk music is so rich with metaphors for human growth and development. And what it came from was looking out across, we were standing pretty far back. So looking out across the people and listening to the bands and just seeing the diversity, people representing different genres in their gear, people of different ages, children, adults of various ages and stages, dad bods, mom bods,
Yeah,
just all this different look. And I was like, what is it that brings so many different people together on a hot day to stand outside on some pavement and listen to some music? And everyone here is having their own personal and collective movement of sorts. And it just made my brain whir. And then a few days later, I think I dropped a text in to Matt and Meg and was like, I have this crazy weird idea. I don't even know. And you and I just started having Zoom chats every couple of weeks and talking about all sorts of different things in punk, bands, genres, movements, experiences, stains, successes, etc., and kind of found our pathway to this project.
yeah. And I think that like the one part of everything that you just listed about those conversations about punk and coaching and life and the complexities of all of it, NoFX is all of that in one band, in one very out in the open They've been very public about who they are. There's a memoir. There's a myriad interviews and posts and songs that really document the complexities of that band, and I think it's a band that you can really easily see yourself in. You can see the punk rock community in. I like listening to you talk about those shows and that we've been to, and then thinking about that very last NoFX show, the one they live streamed from LA, and all the people who were out there, and they played the Decline, and then everybody's out on the stage playing along with them, their friends, and the just the energy and the passion. And it's like that band, that moment that their 40 years, 40 cities goodbye tour that they did that took 2 years to complete, everything about that is just, like, so indicative of punk, and then you start thinking about their journey as a band and how it's representative of, like, a life journey in a lot of ways, and then, like, I'll even get a little bit deeper on it, like, the NoFX becomes a band in 1983. I was born in 1983, right? So, like, we're
Ouch.
out there, like, doing the farewell stuff, and it's just, like, watching and knowing what they've been through in the tenors of their life and the ups and the downs and all that sort of stuff, and having this, like, feeling of, like, "Oh, yeah, like, their journey has been my journey in this, like, kinda chronological sense," but then also, being able to see yourself in the band and the band members and the songs and how they have fostered that as a band. There was always this huge part of, like, the NoFX community, as opposed to just a band by itself or, part of a scene or part of a moment in the mid-90s when punk exploded. NoFX is, I think, in a lot of ways, been very intentional about how the band relates to each other, the people around them, and their fans, right? And I think that that's part of, like, what you were feeling and experiencing in that moment was, like, the culmination in a lot of ways of that project of theirs. And I don't even know if it was a self-conscious project, but, like, clearly you can feel it. And the farther away I get from it, the more I can see it.
Yeah, absolutely. I I find it so fascinating how NoFX has lived out loud in such a way. Many bands are on stage, they're performing, but they're not living
Mm.
out loud. And NoFX has chosen to be the historians of their own stories, their own historists, if we might.
Yes, yes.
Where they've intentionally produced and put out a documenting of their evolution individually and collectively.
Mhm.
And with that, you can see that story arc that is like a lifetime story arc in one band, where no one human is exactly the same start to finish. There are certain core things about us that are always there, but how they are turned up or down in our life varies over time. And we see that with no effects as well, sometimes intentionally and sometimes unintentionally.
Right.
But we see them demonstrating a humanity within a group that performs. And that's a rare gift in music that's not overly cultivated. It's cultivated in extent, but not overly cultivated so that there's a distance from humanity there. Humanity is the foundation of their band.
Yeah, 100%. And, you know, for people who don't know, like the documentation that you're talking about, they have a memoir called the Hepatitis Bathtub and Other Stories. There's also a couple of international tour documentaries called Backstage Passports. We can throw up the information for that as always. And then there's an extensive public interview and like, online blogging almost. It's not blogging, but like this documentation of the band, and it's really raw. But I think that's the part of this that's really interesting. Like you said, this idea of this humanity and this commitment to others through our own humanity. At various times, multiple members of the band have dealt with like near crippling. In one case, in Smelly, the drummer's case, the almost life-ending drug addiction. Um, Fat Mike has talked a lot about his utilization of drugs and alcohol to just continue to be a performer, how much he hated being a musician and how much he hated the pressures of having to be Fat Mike, and using drugs and alcohol to get himself into a place where he could be that person. The Cokie the Clown character that he creates as a way to explore this duality of who he is, and this guy who goes on stage and he yucks it up and he tells the jokes and he's all crazy, but that's not really who he is, like a clown wearing the makeup. And then like just the plethora of songs that are autobiographical in a way that is like really raw. It's really amazing to think about the fact that like one, they made it as a band. The first 10 years, they're not a good band by any stretch of the imagination. Not only are they not good musicians, and we've been over this before, there's lots of bands. The Ramones comes to mind, right? It's this like self-taught set of musicians that find their way to their craft. These guys were awful musicians, and they were trying to emulate other people's styles of music, and so it was really hollow and didn't transcend, didn't really connect with audiences. They're this perpetual also ran. They're putting out albums DIY, and they're doing the punk rock stuff, but you know when El Jefe joins the band, for example, and he's playing with them at one of the early practices, he's like, "Hey, like you guys need to tune your instruments. Like, like we just need to sound like a band. Like, let's start there." And then to think that like by the early 90s, they finally break through because they start to lean into this who they are. And that their breakthrough album is titled White Trash, Two Hebes and a Bean, which is a wink at like, this is who we are. We're these kind of just like these guys that are kind of schmucks and we're nothing special. But I think there's something there about just like this ability for them to find a way to overcome, to trust in each other. And then as Smelly starts to clean up, Mike starts to fall apart, and there's this drift and this yaw, and there's people get married and they have kids and they have families, and the complexities of being a working band in the late 90s and the 2000s and the financial pressures of it all. And they find a way to make it through always. And it's just really this is punk, like in a lot of ways. Like life is messy and complicated, and if you're focusing on yourself too much, you're the misfits and you fall apart, or you're Scott Sturgeon and you become the self-destructive asshole. If you focus on other people, like you kind of lose yourself, and we talked about that with New York hardcore, right? And you give out so much over to others, and it's really meaningful, but then things burn out and they spin out. NoFX found a way to like transcend and break through to understanding this commitment to this community that they fostered, which I think is like the third time I've said that. But it's just like it's really just I miss them because there's something that made you feel complete when you were at a NoFX show.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, first, I want to say, who's the coach now?
Yeah, you totally got me.
Through this process, we have both absorbed more of one another's talents. I'm much more articulate in understanding and talking about the punk scene itself and the history of punk, that I am much more into music for music's sake and less of a historist. And so I've really absorbed that and can now speak about a genre that I love with a whole new respect and level. And likewise, over the year plus that we've been on this journey of talking about these things, I see in you this Coach Matt coming out.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun. It's been fun. Yeah, learning and understanding how we relate to each other and ourselves. And yeah, I'm really thankful that you had this idea for this project because it gives voice and shape, form to something that like I think so many of us feel, particularly when we're at the show. Right. I think it's not a coincidence to me that you had this idea to do this coming out of that last show that they did in Denver, because that to me has always been what punk rock is. It's that collective communal experience, and then understanding that, like, how you feel, that euphoria that you feel, there's these underlying layers and complexities there that are worth analyzing to understand why it is that you feel the way that you do, and to be able to enjoy, not just reach out. I want the next punk rock fix. I need the next album. I need the next show. I need this next thing. But to actually sit in it and enjoy um, why you feel the way that you do. I've been really appreciative of that as we, start to wrap up this season. It's been really cool to um, understand that there's a lot of complex machinations that are at play here when we feel the way that we feel, when we think the things that we think.
Yeah, that has been really quite, fulfilling and surprising to me through this project is the heart aspect and the feelings aspect. There's so much of our life that we're not really sure why we feel a certain way or we connect or disconnect in certain ways, and we don't wanna hyperanalyze our lives. That's problematic in a different way. Those head spirals we've all been in are not
Yes.
healthy. But instead, we're dropping into, not just a heady space, an analytical space, but a heart space, a feeling space. What is it about humanity that works? And sometimes we're looking at what doesn't work to better understand what works. And to bring that around to NoFX, we talked in the Misfits and the Ramones episode, we talked about fortitude. And when I think here about NoFX fortitude, what makes a band work for 41 years, there was 10 years of we're not really making it, quote unquote, making it. What does success look like for us? We haven't found it yet. We haven't even found who we are yet. They were finding themselves along the way.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
I
totally.
talk with so many people who I'm like, I've spent this much time in my career. I should be at this somewhere further ahead. I started my business. It's been a year and a half. Why isn't it making money? Well, this band spent 10 years
I mean, right,
just finding who they were.
they were right on the precipice of it too. In fact, Mike tells in the hepatitis bathtub that he's starting to figure out how he's gonna tell the band that it's over. Right? They're 10 years in, they're floundering. He's out there on tour with, like, Fugazi and some of these other bands, and he's, fronted and written songs for this band for so long, and he's thinking about taking a job as a roadie for Rancid as Rancid is on its upswing, and he's, basically trying to make the decision of, do we do one more go at this? Do we try to write one more album? Do we do one more tour? Or do I take this opportunity to start carrying around somebody else's bass, to start, sound checking somebody else's equipment, and maybe finding my next step? He's got this record label that's not really succeeding. He's got all of these tensions. And yeah, he's right there on the precipice of just walking away from it all. And then, like I said, the next album that hits, boom, that's the one that takes him through. It's really incredible when he tells that story to think, like, wow, how close they were to making it in that moment, but also how close they were to not even being a thing anymore.
Yeah. It reminds me of something that we've talked about quite a bit off mic, but I think the first time we're really bringing it to mic in this way, microphone recording, is that the adversity makes your story, and even the anti-hero's journey is rich. And I don't mean anti-hero in that these guys are really bad guys. They're not. They're great guys. Like, what works is their heart.
Mhm.
Uh, and yet they're not under any delusions that their lives are somehow clean and pristine. It's like, yeah, there was drug addiction here ear early on, and then, substance use later on, and grappling with what use is appropriate use and what use is misuse. So
Right.
that they bring that in this, like, anti-hero realm. And we love anti-hero stories, right? We can think about some of the modern TV epics like The Sopranos, The Wire, Nurse Jackie, other such shows where you're in love with the anti-hero because they're flawed. And it's part of the magic that is NoFX. They're beautifully flawed, and they're in their book, they're so open about, we don't have the answers. We have a story and we have a lot of questions. It's one of the few books I find that actually lets we don't really know what to make of this. Like, they just say that outright and let it be there. And I think there's not enough of that for many of us breathed in our own lives. We feel like we have to make sense of every moment that happens, or why it's happening, or what strategic move we need to make every single time perfectly along the way to achieve our goals. And NoFX is a model for, you don't have to do it perfectly, but you have to do it. And
Right.
sometimes you have to examine it, and sometimes you need to leave it be, and you have to let it shift and change.
Totally, yeah, and I think that and part of that being that model, part of being that element of playing jazz, if you will, to mix musical genres and metaphors and all these things that I always love to do when I talk. But like you have to be there has to be this flexibility with it is really important. Because like yeah, as situations change and as the band starts to deal with its own success and not just their success, but as Fat Records starts to take off and starts to shepherd some of these iconic mid '90s punk rock bands like Propagandhi and Lagwagon, Strung Out, and just the catalog of those mid '90s Fat Records is pretty amazing, in terms of the importance of providing a platform and a way for these bands to break out and do so on an independent label so that they can continue to be what they wanted to be. The pressures of that start to get to Fat Mike, and that's where he starts to, succumb to more drug and alcohol use as the rest of the band is starting to feel like, well, we need to start cleaning things up, Smelly in particular, right? And so you have this like really weird thing where you have one member of the band who had for so long just been this like kind of out of control drug addict who at any given moment may or may not overdose or not show up for a show or whatever. And then this other person who's been this driving, responsible force in Fat Mike, and then they kind of position shift,
Right.
and Smelly gets sober and starts to commit himself to working on the things that in his childhood, his past, how he grew up, to deal with that pain and trauma that he outlines in the book, and how he couldn't be around the drugs and the partying and everything else. And Fat Mike, needs a way to get rid of this tension and pressure that he's felt for so long, and he starts to turn to drugs and alcohol, and that starts to get in the way of the shows sometimes, and his ability to finish a show in particular, which is really well documented on the Backstage Passports. And then, later, how it breaks up his marriages. And then eventually a good friend of his, the frontman, Tony Sly, for No Use for a Name, who overdoses. And, he and Mike were friends, but they also used together. And there's just a lot there. And yet the band continues to push forward and find a way to deal with everything. And again, I just think of so many punk bands that weren't able to do this, and the ones that are find this way to continue to push forward. And then NoFX did it in a way that they stayed relevant, and prolific. I mean, they have so many albums and they have so many tours, and a band that, as I was talking, I was like, this is very reminiscent of the conversation we had about Rancid. But the difference is like Rancid has these long hiatuses where the
Right.
band is not, they can leave and come back, and they can be creative, and they can trust, and they believe in each other. And so there, all that internal tension is really managed effectively within Rancid. NoFX, with all of this tension and pressure and chaos, continue to just make music and to tour and to be the out front personas for punk rock during this time period. It's really incredible that they're able to make it through, especially Fat Mike's chaos in particular, his internal chaos.
Yeah, I want to talk about here um repression. So in some ways, I see in Fat Mike a model of motherhood of all things, which is particularly interesting given how he later moves out of his own repression.
Hmm.
Um But Fat Mike is sort of the mother role of NoFX. He is organizing, he is managing, he is dealing with people's messiness. He's the one putting together their tours and later goes on to serve him well in creating Fat Record. He has this organizational ability that is often in a family unit the mom role, and he's keeping everything together. He's making the unit work. And it's why it's on him to decide, essentially, whether they continue on or they don't at various junctures. He was the one thinking he was going to have to break it to the band that they were breaking up because he's the mother figure. He's the glue that holds it together. At the end of their story in this, as it exists today, he was the one who came to the band and said, "It is time for me to be done, thereby it's time for us to be done, and how do we navigate this ungrouping together?" So he has that kind of quintessential mom-like role in the band, and when the rest of the band gets it together and kinda goes off to college, he is only left with the demons he's been
Hmm.
repressing that he needs to deal with. So everybody else grows up, and now he's on a digressive or a regressive path because he's been repressing pieces that he needed more looseness. He needed more. He didn't necessarily want to be the one holding it together all the time, but he was doing that, and once he could let go, he really let go in a lot of ways. He
Yeah, he did.
went into his own substance abuse journey, and he also within that found a reclamation. So it's not always that when the dam bursts, it's a bad thing because he found a lot of things about himself that brought him a lot of peace. He speaks, quite articulately to or articulately about coming to terms with his own sexual proclivities
Hmm.
and his own expressions of self. And he starts to play with both sexual identities, but also the visual representation of sexual identities in his personal and professional life. He finds a new version of himself once all of that buttoned upness is let go. And one of the things that I notice a lot when I work with women who are mothers and mother figures is so much self sacrifice for the greater good that they get to these burst points that feel really uncomfortable and unhealthy. And I would I offer a few things in that realm here, which is one, we don't have to go as far until we might burst. There are ways that we can regulate and modulate and still fill our roles, and that there is something beautiful that can come out of when you realize you've gone too far. And
Yeah.
that burnout metaphor, Fat Mike was burned out, and this was his expression. I have been burned out. And went on my own journey of changing careers and rebuilding in a new way to get where I am today. Was the depression terribly oppressive? It absolutely was. Did something really magical come out of that as a career change and even a podcast and all sorts of other things that I get to do now? Yeah, it was worth it.
Yeah, yeah. There's that idea of like creative destruction, and I think that
Yes.
the difference, I think, between like people who can go through things like that and make it work, and then somebody else who goes through the depression, the crisis of self, whatever it might be, and funnels that energy into, like the classic American midlife crisis tropes, is the people around you and how you relate to those people around you. And I think one of the things that like Fat Mike is very clear about is that he understood eventually, like, he had to be true to himself. He had to figure out a way to make himself work, which eventually was like, I need to stop being in the band. The band has to stop being a band. I can't keep doing this and be the person I want to be. But also, as he grew into the person he wanted to be, the rest of the band was there for him. And this is something we've returned to time and time again in terms of, um, you know, when when punk works and when it doesn't. And I would always argue that like punk is not an inherently nihilistic or destructive genre or way of living. Um, the people in punk rock who make it talk about this all the time about the community that you form and staying true to your ethos. And it's the difference between like a Sex Pistols blowing up on stage and Johnny Rotten saying, have you ever felt like you've been cheated and walking off and that's the end of the band, versus like Fat Mike being able to talk to the band and saying like, hey, look, to be me, I've got to stop being Fat Mike, the bassist of NoFX, the lead singer, the creative force. And that doesn't mean I don't like you guys. It doesn't mean that this hasn't meant so much to me. But if I'm going to continue to be me, I'm gonna need to do this. And he knew he could do this. I mean, like you were talking about this idea of Fat Mike figuring out who he's going to be in his persona and everything else. It's the Fat Mike that's wearing a cocktail dress, combat boots, a leather jacket, and a mohawk that's 5 different colors, sporting stubble that, 5 days of no shaving. And knowing that he could go out there and be that version of himself. And the rest of the band was fine with that. Right.
Mhm.
This is still Mike. This is still our friend. This is still our guy. Um, you can only do that, one, if you've spent the time to work with the people around you to foster a community. I never went to a NoFX show, including in the late '90s when they have a pride flag on stage in a period of time where like all of American society was still very homophobic,
Mhm.
and punk rock in particular had a lot of homophobia built right into it and misogyny built right into it. And now here you are with this artist who's stepping out and saying like, "Hey, we're going to put the flag on stage. It's always going to be here, and it's always going to be here from now on." And I feel like dressing up the way I want to dress up in a way that helps me express my identity, my true form of myself, and not there's no space anymore between like you've talked about before, the I thou or I you thou. It's all there simultaneously
Mhm.
because of this what they've built and created. And I think that's when you looked around that last show and you saw all the different people as their authentic selves, that's what we should all be striving for, right, in our lives, is to find ourselves a part of a community like that, where you're not repressed, where you can be fulfilled in who you are, you're comfortable in your own skin and the things that you like. And it no longer has to be about putting on airs. I always feel bad for the people like when I wear my punk rock stuff and I talk to like a dad at my kid's school or whatever, and like, oh yeah, I used to like that band back when I was a kid or whatever. And it's like, still like them now. Like you didn't have to give that up, right? If you
Right.
did, hopefully there was a good reason for it and not because like you felt like you needed to mature or whatever. Because like I feel sorry for those people. I do.
Yeah. Be the version of yourself, wh- whatever version you're meant to be today. For some of us, it's carrying through lifelong pieces. For other of us, it's permission to let go. Or maybe for all of us, it's keeping some lifelong pieces. And it's a willingness to let go of certain ideas, certain perceptions of others and yourself. And it's a constant evolution, is a constant willingness to stick with certain things and let go of certain things or let things take shape. So sometimes it's the relationship with your bandmates and you keep it over time and it changes over time. And sometimes it's you need a new band. We've talked about bands. Operation Ivy to Rancid is a great
Yeah.
example of you need a new band. That band is not meant to be. It had to birth another band. You had to let that one go. And something I spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about with folks is it's important to have models, role models, figures, models, um, even, sure, models for yourself, but models of how things might work. You don't have to reinvent the proverbial wheel. But a model is not a strict blueprint.
Mm,
Someone else's model is not your model. Context matters. So there are predictable pathways, maybe, or pro tips, or certain things that you can do to get to a certain place. But adhering to them rigidly, more often than not, means they don't work. And what we have seen in the arc of this pod season is that when something works, it evolves. And when something doesn't work, it typically has too much rigidity to it or too much um, something lost in nuance, no nuance, so that it's very much all one thing and doesn't have multitudes. And NoFX provides multitudes. They're when they find themselves, it's very clear for the next 30 years that it's NoFX. And there is a trajectory of authenticity that allows for the band to be different over time and to adapt over time.
totally. Yeah, I mean, as you're saying that, I was just thinking about this idea of like they know who they are, they lean into it, they're authentic, and like I'm smiling because I'm thinking of like, their live albums are called like I Heard They Suck Live. And I heard they still suck live was their second one. And it's just like they like just leaning into like we know who we are. And when you come to an NoFX show, it's not going to be the cleanest. Where you've seen them a handful of times. When they celebrate, like, hey, we did 2 songs in a row without messing up, or whatever. Whole sections of songs is forgotten to be played, and and it's fun. It's part of what makes NoFX fun, and the banter between the crowd. I remember I was at a show at the Fillmore in Denver, and someone threw a shoe up at the stage, but it hit one of these big chandeliers that are hanging over the crowd, and it shattered the chandelier, and glass came falling down, and everything had to get stopped. And obviously, the event people aren't happy about it, and the entire time Fat Mike is chastising the crowd, and he's like, we're not going to play Linoleum anymore. We're not, you guys were bad. You were naughty. You're not going to get to hear the song that you want to hear. And then people start throwing stuff at him, and he says like, well, now I'm not going to play this other song, and then eventually he just starts telling stories about how unpunk he is because he goes and plays golf with the guys from Dropkick Murphys, and I think for so many people, you'd feel like if you went to see your favorite musician and they didn't play your favorite songs on purpose, and then spend a huge portion of the show just talking about nonsense. It's not like Propaganda, who is like up there talking about like politics and consciousness and all these other things. Um, they'd be so upset. And you leave a NoFX show after that happens, and you're smiling and laughing, and you're like, dude, that's exactly what I signed up for. That's why I was there. And there's something about that that's just so important to your experience when you're doing whatever you're doing, is authentically doing it and then having the joy in it, which is like the weird part of that Mike talks about it. He's like, he had to get high and drunk to get on stage, and then he'd get on stage and he was super happy that he was up on stage. Right.
Mhm.
And not because he was high or drunk, because that's where he wanted to be. It was just getting him there that was so difficult over and over again over time but he talks about like, I loved it. And that's what is so much fun about NoFX is you can tell they love it. They love to
Yeah.
be up there.
And that's such a useful reminder for us. It's often that we resist, we feel that anticipation that feels like fear and is sometimes fear before we're doing the thing we're meant to do. And Mike talks about that over and over and over, how he used substances to cope with that. But there is something conflicted in him about actually like the building up, the anticipation of getting to the thing I love is the painful part. And I would say that much of the work that we can cover in coaching is dissecting what that painful part is to choose another way to navigate through it, that there are ways other than substances. And yet we all have imperfect ways of coping with parts of our life until we take the time to learn other ways to cope with them.
Right.
And with that, I think it's a perfect time to come to our final thread as we finish talking about NoFX today, which is the choosing to end.
Yes.
And we spoke about it before, and I want to bring it up again that their band didn't implode or explode. It was a very active choice to maturely and adult like come to the table and say, this is run its course.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
come
Mike
to the
Mike
end.
does an interview, right? And he says, essentially in this interview, this like radio spot or somebody's podcast or something like that, internet show, that like, yeah, NoFX is done. And it gets to the other band members, I think Eric Smelly was doing like an interview or something, and someone brought it up, and he's like, "That's the first I've heard of this. I don't know about it." And he talked about how he was upset that that's how he found out, and then like I don't know if we are done. And then the whole band sat down. All four members of the band sat down. And I think one of the roadies, a longtime roadie, Mike outlined, right, which he's never been super like forthwith here. Like, these are the exact reasons why we need to stop. And some of it is he talks about he just couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't live the life he was living. And he recognized that this was going to be the end of him essentially if he continued on this pathway of drug and alcohol use to perform. But he walked the band through, he said, they've all talked about this, his thought process, and they emerged from that meeting and everybody was one unified voice. We're done. This is going to be our last tour. We're not doing a reunion thing, right? I think, Mike has all these jokes about 80s metal bands and stuff like that, the hair bands that like go back on reunion tour after reunion tour. And you're like, well, those bands aren't done, right? Like, he's like, this is it. This is going to be our last show. It's like the last thing he said pretty much is like, this is it. Thank you guys so much. This is the last time you're ever going to see us, right? Um, but they all were like, yeah, no, we're done. That we agree that this is how we're going to end things. And that show that we went to, that like how much fun it was and how the experience was so fulfilling. And then watching the live stream of their last show and them up on stage with Pennywise and Rancid and Bad Religion and just yeah, MXPX, all these bands. I could just go on and on. All these bands, that are out there with them on stage, and Mike talking about like, these are our punk rock brothers, and you as the crowd, that this is what we've been about our entire time. It was so perfect. It was a perfect way to end.
Yeah, and there's a whole piece here about the intentionality allowed them to experience it in a peak way, which we saw very much translated to our experience at that show, where you could feel their love and their deep presence because this is an experience that's about to end. And oftentimes, when we perceive that some things are going to go on forever, and when we start to perceive it that way, we take them for granted and we get a little resentment. We don't enjoy it. We're not as present or as immersed in it emotionally, mentally, physically as much. And this allowed them the opportunity to tune in a new way because it was finite. And we are very much in Western culture so used to being in our creature comforts so much we take them for granted. And they said, here's this creature comfort of doing what we've been doing forever. We're going to choose not to do it. And then we're going to savor, which made a whole new experience for them and an up leveled experience as an attendee. And I think that we could all think more about how intentional we are with continuing or discontinuing something. Because if we decide we're done with something and we're just done, that's appropriate in many situations. But there are opportunities where we could choose to be intentional about being done before we're mentally, physically, and emotionally done, choose to do it earlier, and really enjoy the space of completion versus I've ended and now what? Crisis of faith because I haven't
Yes.
had the time to process the closing and ending of something.
Totally, totally. Because you're right, that vibe at those shows wasn't it felt, like you said, the intentional. Yeah, it really did, and they were so present, and it didn't feel like the end. You knew it was. Everybody there knew it was. I mean, they've been very overt, obviously, about this, right? But still, it didn't feel like the end. It felt like something you wanted to be in there with them in that moment to experience one last time. I remember being done and talking to my wife after we're walking that back out to the car and afterwards, and she's like, "How do you feel?" And I said, "I feel great. I don't feel I feel sad, sure, but it's not like that's not the profound emotion that I feel. Then the band didn't feel like that, right? The show didn't feel like that. So it's like it's a bummer it's over, but like I'm so glad that I got to be a part of all of this and that it ended this way. It didn't end just abruptly, right? I think about another band that I really enjoyed growing up, the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones, who like just like put out a presser and we're like, we're done as a band. See you later. Goodbye. And it's like, man, that sucks. There's this band I loved, and now they're just wiped from the map. And NoFX wasn't like that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a TED Talk that we can add to the show notes about this whole idea of the science of endings and that we often overlook endings because we're so used to the grief that comes with them. But actually, if we're intentional about some of them, there is this celebratory experience that can come with it that is a balance to the grief. But more often than not, we're doing the hard stop and then we're just leaning into the grief versus what we've talked a lot about here um, over the season is the multitudes or the dichotomies or the juxtapositions that you can have both. You can have the bitter and the sweet. And with the pause and the intentionality, you get to have that. And NoFX modeled that for us so well in them saying we're going to take 2 years to really wind this thing down and be present with ourselves, be present with our fans because a band doesn't exist without the audience and the audience doesn't exist without the band. So
Right.
they recognized the audience as the additional band member, so to speak, and then made a transition for themselves and an inclusive transition for the audience that really has touched both of our lives deeply and gave us something to build an entire podcast off of.
Yeah, totally. No, it's pretty amazing to think about. Yeah, when you take the time to actually set things up and create the space for closure, and then go through all of that, how much more positive the outcome is, the ending piece is, and then, like you said, like not only was it the beginning of their end was our beginning for us, and looking and saying like, what is it about this experience that was so wonderful and what can we glean from this if we look at it more intentionally, but then also just that piece of being able to process your own emotions and feelings and move on, and I love how you talk about this idea of like planning things out to ending when you choose to end, and how much that matters, and how much it matters in terms of retaining all the elements of what made something really wonderful for you.
Yeah, I think there's less shoulda, woulda, coulda with the intentionality of it.
Totally,
Yeah.
totally.
So normally, um, when we wrap up with a thank you to a band, it's a band that has spoken with us and shared insights with us. And today, we do not necessarily have that relationship with NoFX, but I personally want to say if it ever gets to any of their ears, and even if it doesn't, um, thank you for all the shoes.
That's right. There it is. There it is. I couldn't agree more. I mean, like, Yeah, it's the one of the oldest patches I have. I still sport it on my vest. It's a NOFX patch, and being able to share NOFX with my kids and my students and all the people that I get to work with, it's been such a joy. I think NOFX to me is exactly what we should all strive for, which is the realization that we're not perfect. We are who we are, and that's okay. And in fact, you're going to get something great out of it.
Yeah. And we should do it anyway, even if we're
Yes.
not perfect yet. Yeah.
100%.
Perfect ending for today's conversation on human growth and life lessons through the lens of NoFX. We'll catch you soon. Bye.
Bye.